Hello, I hope everyone is safe and well and has enjoyed the weekend. The sun is shining, which is fantastic, so hopefully you can get out and enjoy the sun today. I've decided to read The Jolly Witch today, written by Dick King-Smith. When I was younger, he was one of my favourite authors, and I still really enjoy reading his books today. So I hope you enjoy The Jolly Witch. Mrs. Jolly was the school caretaker. She had a short nose and two comfy round chins and curly brown hair going grey. Mrs. Jolly had a ginger cat. She was a friendly, nice and cuddly caretaker. But there was something the headmistress didn't know, or the teachers, or the children. In the autumn term, when Mrs. Jolly swept the playground clear of leaves with a broomstick, even then nobody guessed that she was... What do you think she might be? Think back to the title. A witch. At the end of the school day, when everyone had gone home, Mrs. Jolly, the caretaker, became Mrs. Jolly, the witch. Mrs. Jolly used her powers very sensibly. She made them work for her. To save my legs, she said, for Mrs. Jolly had to clean the whole school, all 3 classrooms and the hall. She took her vacuum cleaner, her dustpan and brush, and her dusters into a classroom and set them all down. Then she sat herself comfortably in the teacher's chair, sipped a cup of tea and said, "Rise and shine." Then up flew the dusters to polish the tables, and up jumped the dustpan and brush to pick up all the paper the children had dropped during the day. The vacuum cleaner uncoiled its flex like a snake, plugged itself in and whizzed off across the carpet. Mrs. Jolly used her electric floor polisher in the hall. It plugged itself in and polished the floor till it shone. And it goes without saying that when all the rooms had been cleaned, the curtains drew themselves and all the lights switched themselves off. The only work Mrs. Jolly did herself was in the autumn, when she swept the playground clear of leaves. Out there in the open there was a risk that people in the village might catch sight of a large broomstick sweeping up the leaves, all by itself. But of course, Mrs. Jolly's broomstick wasn't only used for sweeping up the leaves. Once a year, on a very special night after the children had gone home, carrying the paintings and costumes they had made, none of them knew that on that particular night, as they lay in bed, Mrs. Jolly would be soaring high above them. For on that special autumn night, when the church clock struck midnight, all the witches from about took part in a great broomstick race. At the first stroke of midnight, they all gathered high above the steeple of the village church and flew off towards the next village. From steeple to steeple and round in a big circle they flew in the great witches' steeplechase, until at last they came back to where they had started, and the winner of the race was awarded the title Witch of the Year. "Which witch won?" asked the ginger cat, as usual, when Mrs. Jolly arrived home, puffing and blowing in the early hours of the next morning. "Not me," said Mrs. Jolly, smiling as usual. "I shall never win, I'm afraid." Every year Mrs. Jolly went in for this race, and every year she finished in the same place, last. For Mrs. Jolly was not lean and lanky like the other witches. Mrs. Jolly was a weighty witch, and her broomstick was a big and heavy one. "I should dearly love to win next year," sighed Mrs. Jolly as she got into bed. "Why next year specially?" asked the ginger cat. "Because next year," said Mrs. Jolly, "I'm retiring. It'll be my last race." "Why?" asked the ginger cat. "You won't be a caretaker, but you'll still be a witch." "Yes, I know," said Mrs. Jolly, "but I won't have a broomstick when I retire. It's school property." Next year soon came, and the winter went. Spring and summer flashed by, and it was once again the autumn term. The ginger cat sat in the playground watching Mrs. Jolly. He looked thoughtful, as cats do. After school, when all the children had gone home, Mrs. Jolly set the vacuum cleaner to work while she had a cup of tea. "Cleans better than a broomstick, doesn't it?" said the Ginger Cat thoughtfully. "Goodness, yes," said Mrs. Jolly. "You need a modern machine for cleaning nowadays." "You need a modern machine for racing nowadays," said the Ginger Cat. Mrs. Jolly sat up sharply, spilling her tea. "Me? Ride a vacuum cleaner in the Great Witch's steeplechase?" she said. "But how would it work without it being plugged in?" "Put a spell on it," said the Ginger Cat. "Make it go." "But it sucks things in," said Mrs. Jolly. "Put another spell on it," said the cat. "Make it blow." Mrs. Jolly put down her cup and saucer and got up. She switched off the machine and unplugged it. The vacuum cleaner stood silent in the middle of the classroom floor. "Hi-de-hi, hi-de-ho, don't stop, do go," said Mrs. Jolly, and off it went again. "Hi-de-hi, hi-de-ho, don't suck, do blow," and the machine blew dust all over the classroom. As midnight drew near on the night of the steeplechase, only the Ginger Cat saw the school caretaker come out of her front door, carrying a vacuum cleaner. "Hi-de-hi, hi-de-ho, don't stop, do go," said Mrs. Jolly, carefully arranging herself astride her modern steed. The machine gave out a low, throbbing roar. "Hi-de-hi, hi-de-ho, don't stop, do blow," commanded Mrs. Jolly. And, with a powerful backward blast, they jetted up into the night sky as the first stroke of midnight rang out from the church steeple. By the time Mrs. Jolly had reached the church, the black cloud of witches that had been jockeying for position at the start were already far away, gliding silently through the darkness. Setting both chins firmly, Mrs. Jolly sped off after them. By the second church steeple she had caught up with the slowest witch. By the third she had passed all but the fastest. By the fourth she had swept past the leaders. Now she powered away in front, increasing her lead from steeple to steeple. She could no longer hear the horrid cries of anger from the witches behind. Not another witch was in sight when, in record time, she arrived at the finish first. Mrs. Jolly arrived home early, not a bit out of breath, and with not a curl out of place. Which won?" asked the Ginger Cat, as usual. "I did!" exclaimed Mrs. Jolly. "Left 'em standing. You should have heard them cursing. Cheat!" they shouted. The Ginger Cat looked thoughtfully. I suppose it was a bit unfair," he said. Mrs. Jolly stroked him fondly. "It was," she agreed, "and after the race, 13 witches held an extraordinary general meeting and disqualified me." "So you're not Witch of the Year after all?" said the Ginger Cat. "No," said Mrs. Jolly, "but I was first past the steeple, and that's good enough for me. Thanks to you, I can retire happily." At the end of term, the whole school assembled in the hall. The teachers and the children had bought Mrs. Jolly a leaving present, and the headmistress made a nice speech. "How we shall all miss you, Mrs. Jolly," she said. "You have worked so hard all these years, dusting and sweeping and polishing. Each morning everything in the school was always spotless. All the mess of the day before, gone like magic." Mrs. Jolly just smiled. It was a jolly smile. So I hope you enjoyed that story. Just a couple of questions to get you thinking about what you've read. Why do you think at the end of the story, when the headmistress had said it seemed like magic, Mrs. Jolly gave a really big grin and just smiled? Just have a think about that. And secondly, how do you think the other witches felt about Mrs. Jolly riding a vacuum cleaner instead of a broomstick? Please go across to the blog to share your answers to my questions. I shall also put the questions on there. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.